everyone, welcome back to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl, and my guest today at University Bookstore is writer Kristin Hannah. Kristin, I can't believe it has taken so long to get you on the show, but I'm so glad you're here.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you.
We're here really to both to talk about your new book, just out, The Great Alone, but also I would love to take this opportunity to talk to you about you as a writer and a reader, because I know that you are a huge reader.
Absolutely.
But let's start with how your career as a novelist came about.
Well, it hasn't been sort of a normal course for me. I was a lawyer first, and when I was in my third year of law school, my mom was dying of breast cancer, and so we ended up, spending a lot of time together. And at one point, I was complaining about a class, and she said, don't worry, you're going to be a writer anyway. And we decided, for whatever reason, probably because there was a lot of things we didn't want to talk about. It was a really rough time. I was 25 years old. And so we decided to start writing a book together. And we kind of argued back and forth, being mother and daughter, about what kind of book to write. I wanted to write horror because I was and am a big Stephen King fan. And she wanted to write historical romance. And so, she ultimately said, I'm sick, I win. And we started to write a historical romance together. And that was sort of the beginning. It took me a while to get back to that, but that was the beginning.
And you were always a reader. Your mom said that because she knew what a reader you
are. Oh, absolutely. I was the girl who on every family vacation, my dad was yelling at me, get your nose out of the book, look around where we're going. And I moved around a lot. I went to a lot of high schools, a lot of junior highs. And so books were my friends. They were what I took with me, what made me feel comfortable wherever I was. And there's a big element of that in The Great Alone, because I do think that, especially for kids who are more on the fringes sometimes, books and librarians and libraries can be their salvation.
Well, that's certainly how it was for me. So I'm really, I always love to hear somebody else kind of validate that experience. So you were a big fan of Stephen King.
Yes.
Can you remember the first Stephen King book that you read?
Absolutely, Carrie. I was, I think, 17 or 18, and before then, it had been the Robert Heinlein, Stranger in a Strange Land, and, all of the science fiction.
Right.
I was just a huge science fiction girl. And then I read Carrie, and suddenly I was a horror girl, and it felt like almost like a passage to adulthood. Now I was reading grown-up novels, even though they were before, and I think probably the most seminal one of those early years was It. That was the book that just sort of knocked me back, and it was the first time I remember reading a book and really looking on my own about structure, about style, about how he was telling this story, and I was just amazed by it.
I think the first one that I read was a collection, one of his collections of stories.
Different seasons.
Not that one.
No?
A different one. But and they made the title story, which I always forget the name of, into a very bad movie. And we went. My husband and I went when it was here. It opened in Seattle in the afternoon, and there were like 4 people in the theater, and it was not a good movie. But then I went back and read a lot of them as well. And what I felt is that Stephen King is probably the Charles Dickens of our time. I mean, we don't read Charles Dickens for the stories so much. I mean, he's taught because he's Victorian and all of that. But he's really a fabulous storyteller, and that's what Stephen King can do.
And he also, I think, especially in books like It, or stories like, The Body, or, he has a handle on what it felt like to be an adolescent in a way that very few adults remember. And so because of that, he kind of paints a picture of an era. He's a little bit older than I am, so my childhood doesn't dovetail. But the fact is we all sort of lived the same childhood. So it doesn't matter if it's the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We were all doing the same thing. And there's a big part of him, I think, that speaks to the adolescent in all of us.
Yeah, one of my favorites is Lisey's story.
Oh, that's a good one, yeah.
And I was just going through and making lists of my favorite books for the last 30 years, fiction and nonfiction. And when it came to that year, Lisey's story really stood out for me. And I mean, what he can do that I think people who write with strong plots is that he can make you turn he makes you have to turn the page, even though everything inside you is saying, I don't want to know what happens on
it's like,
that
don't
next
go in that
day.
room.
Don't
Yeah.
go in that room. Right. So was it the story? What was it about the fantasy and the horror? Was it an escape, kind of, or?
You know, I think it's interesting because now that I'm older and I can sort of look at my life in perspective, you get to a certain age and you can start looking back and seeing things differently. And I think the truth is that what I have always loved most and what I've recently begun writing, I think, are stories with really high stakes. You know, I think that's why World War II spoke to me. I think it's why The Survivalist of the Great Alone. And when you're talking about horror, fantasy, whether it's Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, the stakes are the highest possible. They're life and death, it's religion, it's love, it's everything that makes a person go to that deepest, darkest place to survive and thrive. And so I think that's what Stephen and books like that, Anne Rice was another one, Gone with the Wind. There's a lot of books that just really speak to me because the stakes are so high. And I think that's what I love now.
When you think about, and The Great Alone is your 20th novel, is it?
I haven't really counted.
Okay.
It's at least 20, yeah.
I love that you haven't really counted.
I'm afraid.
I think. When you're thinking about a new novel, what do you start with? Do you start with those big stakes or the characters? Or does it depend?
My strength as a writer is definitely characterization. So that's very, very important to me. But I don't simply start with characterization. It's something else. It's characters plus something. It's characters that are seeking something. Like for The Nightingale, for example, it started with the question of, when would I, as a wife and mother, risk my child's life to save a stranger? And once I had that question in my head, then, I look for the characters that answer that question, that follow that path. And then I can sort of layer the stakes on to keep the conflict going, to put them in as difficult a situation as possible. Because I believe that in life, as in fiction, we learn who we are when we have to make the darkest, most difficult decisions. And so I guess that's what I'm really fascinated about. So it's this confluence of character and, I don't know if you call it theme or idea, it is never plot. I'm never interested in what they're doing when I begin.
Mm-hmm. What about, so a lot of your background and your interests come together in The Great Alone. Mm-hmm. So it's set in Alaska from 1974 to nearly the present.
Right.
So it's homesteading in Alaska. Will you talk about how you decided that this was going to be set in Alaska, or was there no question? I mean, what was the process? My dad went to Alaska first in the late 70s, early 80s, my dad and mom, looking for adventure kind of. And they ended up meeting up with a homesteading family, and they began building what became our family business, the Great Alaska Adventure Lodge. And so we have been going to Alaska for most of my adult life. All 3 generations of our family have worked there. So
I have wanted to tackle Alaska forever. Ironically, my very first historical romance was set during the Klondike Gold Rush. So it's kind of coming back in a way to where I started. And with this book, I mean, I had a lot of trouble with it, to be honest, because following the Nightingale's success, it was a little difficult to know quite who I wanted to be and where I was going, and it took me a while to find my footing. And the one thing that always worked was Alaska. I just have this affinity for this place. And it wasn't until I threw the first version of this book away and was looking about 2.5 years ago about where I was going to go. And it was the election year, and all of a sudden the 70s and the turmoil, the political unrest, the social turbulence, the division in the country based on the Vietnam War, all seemed really relevant to me. And because I had come of age during the Vietnam War, and was a kid, a young teenager then, I just felt like I really had something to say. And that was really when this book came together, was sort of this idea that that the 70s have something to say to us today, and that Alaska is someplace that you don't see represented a lot in fiction. And I really wanted to bring my love of the state.
Can I ask what was in that first draft that didn't please you?
Well, I made a very poor decision, actually, to try to write a book that couldn't be compared to The Nightingale. I could tell that The Nightingale, I mean, obviously I didn't know that it was going to do what it did, but I knew that it was special, or it felt special to me. And so I knew I didn't want to write another historical or World War II. I didn't want to write the kind of book where someone could say automatically, wow, it's no Nightingale, you know?
Right.
And so I decided to write what I love to read, which is a thriller. And what didn't work was, like I said earlier, I'm interested in character, I'm interested in theme, I'm not interested in plot. This is a really bad combination for somebody who's trying to write a thriller.
Right.
And so the bottom line was, the more I wrote it, the more I realized I was not interested in red herrings or people that didn't need to be there, or sudden plot twists. And so I decided then, either you throw the whole thing away, scrap it, and start over, or keep what is working, and that was Alaska. And then I went in search of a story set in Alaska. I used all the same characters, but I moved it back, and instead of this thriller in the modern day, it became kind of a coming-of-age survival story in the 70s.
And where did Lenny? Lenny is the main character, and we meet her when she's 13. Where did she come from?
She was always in the book. She was, in the previous drafts, she was always very much the periphery character. She was the character that the thriller was about, what happened to her. And so it wasn't until, when I decided to keep this version of the book and start over, I just was, messing around one day, and I started first person in Lenny's point of view at 13 in 1973. And it felt like coming home. I knew this girl, I knew this moment, I knew what was happening in the world. I had something to say about it. I was, in 1970s, I wore a POW bracelet for a girlfriend's dad who never came home. And so we were very aware of the men coming home, the men who didn't come home, the way they were changed. And so I just realized that a lot of my personal interests, PTSD, were sort of coming together. And it's interesting because, I tackle domestic violence, which is something that I never thought I would, want to deal with because it's so difficult. But it's another thing that feels like this is that moment in time. With Me Too and Time's Up, it's like these conversations are going on, and it feels in a way like there's this collective artistic moment happening where a lot of things that haven't been talked about are being talked about. So,
what gave you the most difficulty in this in the book that I just finished reading? Or maybe nothing did.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The most difficult part was, in writing a book that deals with really dark themes and really difficult themes, in not just becoming sort of relentlessly difficult to read. Trying to keep this balance where there's light and dark, which I think is important. Interestingly enough, it feels to me like the ghost of the thriller is still here. There's still this kind of intensity in this book that is, I think, unusual for me. And I think that's where that comes from, because interestingly, in books, no matter what you throw away, everything somehow remains, little pieces of it. So
a ghost.
Yeah, the ghost in the machine. Right. And so that was the most difficult part. And the way that I handled that was to be very clear in my own head that this was a novel about a woman coming into her own and triumphing over very difficult times. And keeping the triumph and the growth and the maturity in the foreground was important.
Did you have to do research at all about this, or was this all just sort of part of your memories?
No, it's like every book for me. Some are more research intensive. This one, I was helped a lot by knowing the era and by knowing the setting. That was a huge help, say, over Nightingale. But all of the issues, the homesteading and the PTSD, the domestic violence, the law for women at the time, all of that stuff had to be researched.
And one of the characters who's I found just so wonderful in the book is Large Marge, a former lawyer in D.C. who comes to Alaska really to get away from stuff that's happened in the past, which I get the feeling is a lot of the reasons people went to Alaska at that time, and was the final frontier almost. So, and I know from my own experience that every character has some reality somewhere for the author, even though you've never met that character or whatever, you've made them up. But there's something there that is real. Otherwise, I don't think the reader could believe in the character. So where did Large Marge come from?
Large Marge is really from my love and respect for the women who thrive in Alaska. And it's interesting, I've met a lot of women up there. A lot of my friends up there went to Alaska with a man, followed him up there because it was his dream. They broke up, and the women stayed and created lives for themselves. And, they are tough, they're sort of fiercely independent, ruggedly individualistic, and yet a really strong collective female society. And, when you walk around the streets, especially you've been to Homer, so you go to Homer, and you can meet people that are, PhDs from MIT that are now selling fishing nets and living out of a school bus. They live the way they want to live up there. Nobody tells them how. And I think that speaks to a certain kind of person. And it's really easy, I think, to assume that people who live off the grid have some kind of shared background. And I just wanted to say, it's not what you think. There are a lot of people who make these choices.
One of the things that you talk about, one of the things that's important in the book is are there dreadful winters and the darkness, the constant, almost 24-hour period of darkness, and what it's like to exist during that period, and what kind of person it takes to succeed in living through that. And Lenny's father couldn't. That was something. But it reminded me of books about homesteaders in East Texas where the men were always gone, and it was the women in these sod houses trying
with the wind blowing.
The wind blowing.
And that's exactly what I was struck by. Was here we're in the 1970s. Right. It could just as easily have been the 1870s.
Yep.
These are the kind of people who set forth from Boston and went to Missouri and got in a covered wagon and went west with no idea what they were going to find there, and have to then craft a life. And like all pioneers, it does in a lot of ways fall to the women to do sort of all of the ancillary work, the community, the child rearing. Men are off making money, women are back surviving. And I found that to be fascinating because, you just don't think that the 1970s that you'd be dealing with American pioneers.
Right.
But you are.
Yeah, that was what, there's a wonderful Texas writer named Lula Grace Erdman who wrote a few books for young adults, but several adult novels, and one is called The Edge of Time, which is exactly about that.
Really?
And I thought, I kept thinking of that book when I was reading The Great Alone, and the similarities, and what you said about how it could be 100 years earlier, and we would get the same kind of sense of the strength or the lack of strength that it would take. Did you argue with your characters? I mean, I have to say, at times I just wanted to reach into the book and wring some people's necks.
That happens to me a lot. I certainly had that with Nightingale too, where, especially with the characters that you like, you see them making bad decisions. And you desperately, as the writer, want them, don't do that. In Nightingale, I was like, don't write that list. Don't give your friend's name, But again, the point, I think, of fiction, or at least for my fiction, is those big tests. And I think people do make big mistakes all the time. And those mistakes shape your life and shape your soul and shape your future. And I think that if you're angry and if you're yelling at the book or yelling at the movie, whatever, it's because you're engaged and you feel something so strongly. So that's a good thing.
With the Nightingale, you said that nobody knew it would achieve, the huge, wonderful, wide readership and everything that it did. What do you think about the Nightingale was different from, other books that you'd written? Do you think it was the setting and how? I guess what did, because I was thinking about that and trying to.
Certainly World War II helps, because World War II is sort of a conversation that's already in existence, and it brings with it a certain readership and certainly a male readership that wasn't likely to read me before. But I think more than that, I think that starting about 2008 with a book called Firefly Lane, set here in Seattle, I started writing about sort of the strength and durability and resilience of women and the importance of our friendships in our lives and, those sorts of things. And I started with some of the earlier books focusing on the women and their strengths and their ordinary lives. And what Nightingale did was take the strength and durability of women and their relationships and put them in an extraordinary situation.
Ratchet it up.
And it just made it so that now every single thing was not, will I be happy, will I be fired, will I be this? It was, will I live? Will the people I care about live? And so I think it was that combination of World War II and these incredible stakes and a moment in time where we are all sort of realizing, I mean, a lot of us have been realizing for a while, but collectively, the realization that women's stories are being lost, are not being told, are being undertold, and that history has been defined by other people. And so I think you put all of that together and you get a story that is about the courage of ordinary women in extraordinary times and and people just were ready for it.
Well, I'm very happy for you. I think
Thank you.
that's really wonderful. Do you outline? Let's talk about process a little bit. We don't have, we could have started with this question, but I had other things I wanted to talk about first. So how do you approach a novel?
Well, I mean, having now done this for 3 decades, my process has changed and has, been fluid as a river, let me tell you. So in the beginning, I outlined everything. I did character bios. I did tons of prep work and wrote synopses that were very detailed. And then I wrote the book that I set out to write. Mm-hmm. And that was because primarily, the books were simpler than what I'm working on now. But also I had a newborn. And I had very limited amount of time. I had to be very disciplined and sort of rigid. And then as the books became bigger and as my son, finally said, please stop coming to school, I've had enough, and I started having more time, I started imagining bigger books. And as the books got bigger, the outlining worked less well. Because what I discovered for me personally was I couldn't think of it all in the beginning.
Right.
And so that's when I became, I still do the outlines, I still do the synopses. I don't begin writing until I know roughly the first 25 scenes and the final scene. That's when I know that I've got a book, and that's when I start. But I never look at my synopsis again, and I hardly ever write the book I intended to write.
So you knew the ending before you sat down and started. John Irving told me when I interviewed him that he never begins a book until he knows the last line of the book.
Ooh, I wish I had that. I don't have that. But the way, I think it's because, and he's character driven also.
Right.
So for me, at its most basic, a book is a character arc. Mm-hmm. So I have to know where that arc ends to know where it begins. And so that's, I guess, when I know.
One last question. Do you feel with each book that you have said in some way goodbye to these characters?
Yeah, I mean, by the time I'm done, I am exhausted by their story because I've written it and rewritten it and, looked at it through a magnifying glass, and I want to move on. It's why I don't do, by and large, sequels or series.
Right.
I need each book to sort of be its own and then to walk away. I've never read one again. Oh, well, actually, I read Firefly Lane because I had to write a sequel. And I don't think I'll ever write a sequel again. It was too hard.
Well, Kristin, thank you again for coming on Book Lust, and good luck with The Great Alone, and good luck with the film.
The film,
of
yes.
The Nightingale.
Yes.
And I didn't know if I could say that, but I can. Thank you. Thank you. And we all really look forward to your next book.
Thank you. And yours as well.
Thank you.